Silas Whitlock pressed the pen into his daughter's hand and told her to sign her name, and Abigail signed it. Because she had never once imagined that her own father was signing her life away. The driver didn't speak the entire 40 miles. When the wagon stopped, he threw her suitcase into the dirt, turned the horses, and left without looking back. She was standing alone in front of a stranger's ranch with a broken latch and a broken mirror, and one truth she hadn't been given. She had not been sent here to be married. She had been sold. Subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The wagon hit the last rut in the trail so hard that Abigail Whitlock's teeth snapped together, and she grabbed the sideboard to keep from pitching over. The driver hadn't spoken in 4 hours. Not since they'd climbed above the tree line and the air had turned sharp and thin, despite the brutal summer heat pressing down on everything below. Up here the sun was merciless. The dust was orange. The pines were black against a bleached-out sky. "How much farther?" she asked. The driver didn't answer. She had stopped expecting him to somewhere around midday. Abby's father had explained it simply, the way Silas Whitlock explained everything he didn't want questioned. A debt, a long-standing obligation to a man named Gideon Mercer who ran cattle on Cedar Ridge. A respectable arrangement, nothing to be frightened of. "You'll be well cared for," Silas had told her, straightening his collar in the mirror rather than looking at her. "He's expecting you." "What does that mean, expecting me?" "It means what it means." "Abigail, don't make this more dramatic than it is." She had asked him 4 times in 4 days for a clearer explanation. 4 times he had redirected, reassured, and finally gone quiet in the particular way that meant the conversation was finished whether she was satisfied or not. The morning of her departure, he pressed $100 into her hand money. She later realized was not for her comfort, but to prevent her from asking questions at the stage office, and told her the driver would see her safely to Cedar Ridge Ranch. Safely. The word had felt strange even then. The wagon lurched to a stop. The driver didn't climb down to help her. He reached behind the seat, grabbed her suitcase, and dropped it over the side. It hit the dirt and one of the clasps broke open, spilling a folded dress and her mother's small hand mirror across the ground. "Wait," Abby said. He was already turning the horses. "Excuse me." She grabbed the side of the wagon. "I haven't been told where." "Cedar Ridge." He pointed with his chin toward the long, low ranch house and the split-rail fences beyond it. "That's it. But I need to move." She had to step back or be struck. The wagon pulled away without another word from the driver, without a backward glance, without a single acknowledgement that he had just deposited a woman alone in 40 miles of wilderness, with a broken suitcase and no explanation. Abby stood very still. The dust from the departing wagon drifted over her. She could hear cattle somewhere beyond the fences. She could hear the wind moving through the high pines. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was not behaving the way she needed it to. She picked up the dress. She picked up her mother's mirror. The glass was cracked now, split clean across the middle, and she pressed it between her palms until the shaking in her hands stopped. Then she turned toward the ranch house, and she saw him. He was standing in the shadow of the porch overhang, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not read from 20 feet away, and wasn't certain she wanted to read any closer. He was enormous in the way that men who work with their bodies for years become enormous not from vanity, but from simple accumulated labor. Long dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders. A beard so thick it made his jaw look like something carved rather than grown. His brown leather vest hung open over bare, sun-darkened skin, and his forearms carried old scars the way wood carries old marks without apology. Just as proof of what had passed through. He hadn't moved since she first saw him. He was just watching. Abby's first instinct was to turn around and chase that departing wagon on foot. Her second instinct, the one she had relied on her entire life when the first instinct was completely impractical, was to hold still. "Lift her chin and speak first." "My father said you were expecting me." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was proud of that at least. The man on the porch was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your father promised me a debt. He never told me the payment was a woman." The words landed somewhere below her ribs. She heard them correctly. She processed them. She stood absolutely still, because the alternative was letting her knees do what they were threatening to do. He came off the porch then, moving toward the trail where the wagon had gone. The driver had apparently also been carrying a letter. Because Gideon Mercer reached the man before he'd gotten 20 yards and took an envelope from him, she hadn't seen the exchange happen. Hadn't known there was anything else to hand over. The wagon continued. Gideon stood in the trail and opened the envelope. Abby watched him read it. She watched his face. She watched the particular stillness that crossed a person's expression when they were reading something that made them want to put their fist through something solid. "What does it say?" she asked. He looked up at her. "How much did your father tell you about why you were coming here?" "He said he owed you a debt." "He said this was an arrangement." "An arrangement." Gideon repeated the word the way a man repeats something when he's deciding whether to laugh or not. "That's what he called it." "What does the letter say?" He held it out. She crossed the distance between them, which took more deliberate courage than she wanted to admit, and took the paper from his hand. His fingers were rough. She noticed that stupidly. Irrelevantly, the way the mind fixes on small details to avoid the large ones. She read the letter. The handwriting was her father's. She had watched that handwriting compose church donation receipts and supper invitations and financial ledgers her entire life. "Gideon, I am sending my daughter Abigail in satisfaction of what is owed between us. She is 25 years old, capable in domestic matters, and unmarried. You may keep her as wife, housekeeper, or servant as suits your needs, provided you agree by the acceptance of this arrangement never to pursue the matter of Caleb Mercer in Denver or by any other means. Consider the account settled." Silas Whitlock. Abby read it twice. She read it a third time because the first two readings had not fully convinced her brain that what her eyes were seeing was real. "You may keep her as wife, housekeeper, or servant as suits your needs." The paper shook slightly in her hands. She realized the shaking was not the paper. "The matter of Caleb Mercer," she said. "Who is Caleb Mercer?" was Gideon said. "My brother." She looked up at him. "Was. He's been dead 15 years. The air between them held that information for a moment without either of them moving. "My father—" She stopped. Started again. "My father owed you something because of your brother?" "Yes, and he paid you." Her voice had gone very quiet. "He paid you with me." Gideon didn't answer. He didn't need to. The letter was still in her hands. Abby turned. The wagon was a brown smear of dust somewhere down the mountain trail, already dropping below the first switchback. She started walking toward it. She was aware, dimly, that she was walking quickly, that her boots were sliding slightly on the loose, dry dirt of the trail, that she had left her suitcase behind, that none of those things mattered because she needed to get off this mountain. "Miss Whitlock," she kept walking. "The horses are already a quarter-mile down. That trail drops 200 feet in the next half-mile, and there are 3 places where a horse can make the turn and a person on foot cannot." She stopped. The dust from the vanished wagon drifted back over her in the hot wind. "Let me go," she said without turning around. "I am." She turned. He was standing in the same place, arms at his sides now. His expression was not threatening. It was not triumphant. It was just honest, in the way that uncomfortable things are honest. "I'm not stopping you," he said. "I am telling you that it's 98 degrees, and you have no hat and no water, and the nearest settlement is 40 miles from where you're standing. Then I'll walk 40 miles. In dress boots." She looked down at her feet. She looked back up at him. "I didn't buy you," Gideon said. "I want to be clear about that. Your father had no right to send you here. And what's written in that letter doesn't bind you to anything. But if you walk off this mountain before sundown, you won't make 10 miles. She stared at him. "There's a stage that comes through Red Hollow 12 days from now," he continued. I'll give you a horse, food, and enough money to reach the next town in safety when it comes. But tonight, he glanced at the position of the sun. Tonight you stay. And if I don't trust that, then you're sensible. She hadn't expected that answer. He turned back toward the ranch house. There's water inside. You've been in a wagon since before dawn. He didn't look back. Supper's around 6. Nobody's going to force you to eat it. Abby stood in the trail for another moment. She looked at the dust where the wagon had been. She looked at the mountain falling away below her, vast and brown and merciless under the afternoon sun. Then she walked back and picked up her broken suitcase. He gave her the cabin, not a corner of it, not a spare room, the whole of it, with the door latch on the inside and 2 windows that opened toward the porch and the corral respectively, and could be barred with a wooden crosspiece. Gideon himself moved his bedroll to the barn loft without being asked, without announcing it as a gesture, without expecting anything for it. She discovered this only because she went to the door after midnight sleepless, heart hammering in a way it hadn't slowed from since the wagon left, and looked out to see whether there was a light in the house. The cabin was dark. The barn had a faint lantern glow through the loft gap. She stood in the doorway for a while with the warm night air pressing against her face, listening to the cattle moving in the dark beyond the fence, and tried to reconcile the man in her father's letter, use her as suits your needs, with the man who had moved himself to a barn loft without a word. She couldn't. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep. But she stopped shaking somewhere around 2 in the morning, which she counted as progress. He was at the pump when she came out at dawn, working the handle with one arm and running water over his head and neck in the brutal way that men who don't care about comfort wash when there's work waiting. He heard her boots on the porch and straightened. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Tin pot. Don't touch the cast iron handle, it runs hot." "Thank you," she said. Because her mother had raised her to say thank you, and some instincts survive even the worst 24 hours. She went inside. She found the coffee. She stood at the small window that faced the corral and drank it black because she couldn't find the sugar bantin without opening every cabinet in a stranger's kitchen, and that felt like too much liberty for 8 o'clock in the morning on the second day of a situation she had not yet fully named. Through the window she watched Gideon dry his face with a cloth, pick up an axe from beside the woodpile, and begin splitting logs with the focused efficiency of a man who has done something at the same hour for so many years that it requires no thought at all. She watched him for longer than she meant to. Then she looked at her coffee. She had 600 questions she needed answers to. She had prioritized them in her head the way she had always managed her father's household accounts, most urgent first. Details later. Everything recorded so nothing could be denied. She needed to understand what her father owed this man. She needed to understand who Caleb Mercer was and how he had died. She needed to understand whether Gideon Mercer intended to honor his stated intention of letting her leave on the next stage. And she needed to understand one more thing, the thing underneath all the other questions. The thing that had kept her company all through the sleepless night. Why had her father been afraid enough of this man to send her here, instead of simply running? The rider arrived around 10 o'clock in the morning. He came down the north trail fast, and Gideon stepped away from the fence he'd been mending and watched him come in with the particular stillness that Abby was beginning to recognize as the way this man paid attention to things he wasn't sure about yet. The rider was a young man, maybe 20, wearing a leather vest with a star-shaped tin badge pinned slightly crooked to it. He pulled up at the fence and tipped his hat at Abby, who was standing near the porch with her arms folded, and then looked at Gideon Mercer Dawson. Gideon set down his fencing tool. "What brings you up this way?" "Got a message from Sheriff Aldous." The young man reached into his saddlebag. "Wanted you to have it personally." He extended a folded paper. Gideon crossed the yard and took it. He read it. His face went still in the same way it had gone still over her father's letter. and Abby felt her stomach drop, in anticipation of whatever was coming next. "What does it say?" she asked. Gideon looked at the writer. "When did Aldous get this?" "Yesterday evening. Came through on the telegraph from Denver. How many men?" "4." The telegram said. "Maybe more." The young writer glanced at Abby with an expression that was part curiosity and part something else she didn't like. "There's a name, Mercer. Man named Hollis Crane. Aldous says he's been making inquiries. Asking whether a woman traveling alone had passed through." Another glance at Abby. "Aldous thought you ought to know," Abby said. "Why would someone be looking for a woman traveling alone?" Neither man answered immediately. "Who is Hollis Crane?" Gideon folded the paper. He thanked the writer, who tipped his hat again, and turned his horse back up the north trail without lingering. The dust from the horse's departure hadn't settled before Abby said, "Tell me." "He's a debt collector," Gideon said. "Works for railroad men. The kind that doesn't stop when asked politely. And he's looking for a woman traveling alone." "Yes." She processed that. "He's looking for me." Gideon didn't answer, which was an answer. "Why would a railroad debt collector be looking for me?" She heard her voice go very level and quiet, and recognized it as the voice she used when she was on the edge of something she wasn't ready for. "I have no connection to railroad men. My father is a cattle speculator." "He doesn't." She stopped. Her father was a cattle speculator. Her father was a cattle speculator who had debts. Her father had sent her away 3 days after what she now understood was a planned departure. Packed and ready, not arranged over weeks but assembled quickly. Urgently, in the particular way that a man packs for someone else when he needs them gone before something arrives. He knew, she said. Gideon was watching her work through it. He wasn't rushing her toward the conclusion, and he wasn't helping her avoid it, and she found she hated and respected both of those things simultaneously. "He knew someone was coming," she said. "My father knew someone was coming, and he sent me away before." She stopped again. "He didn't send me to you as a debt payment." Gideon waited. "He sent me toward you," she said slowly, "because he knew someone else was coming. And he wanted me somewhere else when they arrived. That's part of it." "Part of it." "Yes, what's the rest?" Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun was cutting through the pines at an angle that put half his face in shadow. A hawk crossed the sky somewhere above the north ridge. "You sure you want to hear all of it today?" he asked. It was not a condescending question. She recognized the difference. He was asking genuinely, the way a person asks when they understand that some information changes things irrevocably, and there is no benefit to forcing the change before a person is prepared for it. "Today," she said. He nodded once. "Come inside," he said. "This takes a minute." He told her about Caleb over black coffee at a table that had seen better decades. In a cabin that smelled of pine resin and wood ash, and the particular dry warmth of a summer that hadn't offered rain in 3 weeks. He told it plainly, without performance, the way a man tells a story he has lived with so long that he has stopped needing to arrange it for effect. 15 years ago, he and his younger brother Caleb were transporting cattle sale money through New Mexico on a route they had arranged privately with the buyer. A route that very few people knew. They were ambushed at a creek crossing on the second day. 3 men came out of the rocks above the trail. Caleb was shot before Gideon had fully registered that the men were armed. He was 22, Gideon said. He said it without additional color. Just the fact of it, but the absence of color in his voice was the most expressive thing about the whole account. "I survived," he said. "Took me 2 years to find out who sold that route." "My father," Abby said. "Your father owed money to the men who hired those thieves. He gave them our route in exchange for forgiveness of the debt." Gideon turned his coffee cup once on the table. "By the time I tracked it back to Silas, 15 years had passed. The men who pulled the triggers were dead or gone. What I had was a letter that implicated your father and no legal way to use it." He paused. "I wrote to him. I told him I wanted him to come to Cedar Ridge and admit what he'd done, and instead he sent me. Instead he sent you." Abby stared at her coffee cup. "He didn't tell you," she said. When he arranged this, whatever he called this arrangement, he didn't say that the man waiting at the end of the trail had a reason to hate our family. No. He sent you a 25-year-old woman and called it a settled account. Yes. She was quiet for a while. Outside, the cattle made their slow sounds. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere on the north side of the ranch, a door was banging softly against its frame in the intermittent breeze. "And Hollis Crane," she said finally. "What does my father owe him? I don't know all of it yet." Gideon's voice was careful. "But Crane doesn't work for small debts. Whatever Silas owes him, it's significant. So, my father," she said, each word deliberate, "sent me to a man he'd wronged, hoping that man would what? Protect me, accept me as payment and disappear, I think," Gideon said. "That Silas has been running from several different directions for a long time. And sending you here was the fastest solution to more than one problem." She looked at him. "He put me in the middle," she said. "Yes. He used me." Gideon didn't soften it. "Yes." Abby set her coffee cup down on the table very carefully. She pressed both hands flat on the worn wood surface. She breathed. "All right," she said. Gideon looked at her. "All right," she said again, and it was not a collapse. It was not acceptance of defeat. It was the voice she recognized from herself at 18 when her mother died, and at 21 when the family money disappeared, and at 23 when her father's business failed, and she had without anyone asking her to, reorganized the household and kept them solvent for 2 years on almost nothing. It was the voice of a woman deciding to think. "Crane's men are in the region," she said. "Yes, and if I try to travel to Red Hollow for the stage, they may be watching the trails. Possibly. And staying here." She stopped. "What does staying here give me besides a different kind of exposure? A roof. Water. Supplies." And he paused as though weighing something. "Me." She looked at him fully. "That last one isn't necessarily reassuring." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't expect it to be. Why would you help me?" Your father is the one who wronged me. Not you." His voice was flat and simple, and she heard no performance in it whatsoever. "You didn't know what he did, and you didn't choose to come here. You didn't choose for me to come here either. No. But you're here now." He stood up, carried his cup to the basin by the window. "You can take the bunkhouse, keep the cabin, or try the trail to Red Hollow yourself. 3 choices. The decision is yours." She stared at the back of him. In 25 years, she could not immediately recall the last time someone had laid out her available choices and then simply stopped and waited for her to choose among them without filling the silence with suggestions or steering or quiet management toward the outcome they preferred. "You're actually asking," she said. "I'm telling you your options." He turned around. "Then I'm waiting for you to tell me what you want." "My father never." She stopped herself. "I'm not your father," Gideon said, not harshly, just as a fact. Abby straightened. "I'll take the bunkhouse," she said. He nodded once. "I'll need to know what work you need done," she added. "I won't stay idle for 12 days. Something moved briefly across his expression. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like a man who has been expecting one kind of answer for so long that a different answer takes a moment to process. "Ranch records need organizing," he said. "If you have any head for figures, I kept my father's household accounts for 7 years. Then the records are in the crate beside the desk." He walked out. She sat at the table for another moment. Then she stood up, found the crate beside the desk, and opened it. The papers inside were a catastrophe. Feed purchase receipts mixed with cattle sale records, mixed with supplier letters, mixed with what appeared to be 3 years of undated inventory lists, written on the backs of envelopes. She pulled out a handful and looked at them, and then looked at another handful, and then sat down at the desk. She had seen worse. She had seen her father's books when he was trying to hide things. These were just neglected, not dishonest. Just the records of a man who understood cattle and mountains and seasons but found paperwork about as natural as a fish finds climbing. She found a clean sheet of paper in the desk drawer. She uncapped the ink. She began. She did not cry until late that evening. She had moved her things to the bunkhouse, which was small and spare, and smelled of horses and hay and other men's labor. And she had organized what little she had into the single shelf above the rope bed, and she had hung her mother's cracked mirror on the wall, because it was her mother's, broken or not, and she had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own split reflection and thought about what her father had written in that letter. You may keep her as wife, housekeeper, or servant as suits your needs. She had kept her father's house. She had managed his meals, his accounts, his social obligations, his creditors' patience. She had done it without complaint, because that was what a woman in her position did. What her mother had done, what the world had arranged as the natural order of things. And at the end of all that keeping, her father had written her name on a piece of paper and handed her to a stranger to settle a grievance she hadn't known existed. She pressed her hands against her mouth. She did not make a sound. The important thing, the thing she told herself very firmly, in the voice she used when the alternative was coming apart, was that the man in the main house had read that letter, and his first response had not been to accept the terms. His first response had been to say, I didn't buy you. She didn't know yet whether to trust that. She didn't know yet what Gideon Mercer was fully, or what he wanted, or whether the quieter version of him that had walked her through 3 choices and waited for her answer was the real version, or the version he showed to women he needed something from. She knew that she was on a mountain 40 miles from town with a man she had met yesterday. She knew that her father had sold her and called it an arrangement. She knew that somewhere between here and Denver, a man named Hollis Crane was looking for her with 4 or more armed men beside him. She pressed her hands harder against her mouth. Then she lowered them. She looked at her own face in the cracked mirror, split across the middle, one half slightly higher than the other. All right, she said to herself. Quietly, in the empty bunkhouse with the summer dark pressing against the window. All right, she thought. She was not helpless. She was frightened and betrayed, and 40 miles from anything familiar. But she was not helpless. She could read and write and calculate. She could organize a household that had been run on nothing. She had survived 7 years of her father's failures by being more competent than anyone around her expected. And she could survive 12 days on a mountain ranch by being exactly that again. 12 days. The stage came through Red Hollow in 12 days. She could do 12 days. She looked at her reflection one more time, both halves of it, split by her mother's cracked glass. Then she lay down on the rope bed, pulled the thin blanket up in the summer heat anyway, because something about the weight of it helped, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the main house, she was aware, the light in the front window was still on. She didn't know why that mattered, but it did. The morning after Abby made her decision about the bunkhouse, she woke before dawn with a clarity that surprised her. She had expected to feel worse. She had expected the night to compress everything into something heavier, the betrayal. The isolation, the particular humiliation of being handed to a man like a promissory note. But somewhere between midnight and the first gray light coming through the bunkhouse window, something in her had shifted, not resolved. Just settled, the way a wound stops bleeding, not because it's better, but because the body simply gets on with the business of surviving. She was going to survive this. She got up, pulled her dress straight, pinned her hair without a glass, because she wasn't looking at that cracked mirror twice in one morning, and walked to the main cabin. Gideon was already gone from the barn. She could hear him somewhere beyond the corral, talking to someone, the low, unhurried voice of a man giving instructions to ranch hands who'd apparently arrived before she was awake. She didn't go out. She went to the desk, opened the crate of records, and continued from where she'd stopped the night before. By mid-morning, she had sorted 3 years of purchase receipts into date order, identified 2 supplier invoices that had been paid twice, and found a cattle sale record from the previous autumn that listed 14 head delivered but showed payment for only 11. Someone had underpaid Gideon Mercer by a meaningful amount, and either Gideon hadn't noticed or hadn't cared enough to chase it. She wrote the discrepancy on a separate sheet with the buyer's name and the date. Gideon came in around 10, poured coffee without acknowledging her presence, drank half of it standing at the window, and then noticed the organized stacks on the desk. He was quiet for a moment. "You did all that this morning," he said. "And last night." She didn't look up. "You've been overpaying your feed supplier. He's been rounding up on every invoice by roughly 8%. Over 3 years, that's a substantial amount." Silence. "Also," she continued, "a buyer named Alderman Thomas Alderman, I think, took 14 head last October and paid you for 11. Whether that was intentional or a counting error, I can't say. But you have the delivery record and the payment receipt, so you could raise it with him." She set down her pen and looked up. Gideon was staring at the desk with the expression of a man discovering that his house has a floor under the dirt he'd been walking on. "I know cattle," he said finally. "I know," she said. "And I know accounts. It seems we're both useful in different directions." He looked at her for a moment. Not with warmth exactly, but with something that was the beginning of a reassessment. "There's fence to mend on the east side," he said. "You can ride? I'll show you." She stared at him. "You're going to teach me to ride a horse. I'm going to teach you to saddle one first." He set down his coffee cup. "Come on." She followed him outside into the brutal morning heat because the alternative was sitting in the cabin being grateful. And Greta felt like the wrong posture for everything that was currently happening to her. The horse was a bay mare named Esther, who regarded Abby with the particular patient skepticism of an animal that has seen many beginners and holds strong opinions about their prospects. Gideon showed her how to stand at the shoulder, how to lift the saddle without wrenching her back, how to check the girth twice before trusting it. "She'll bloat if she thinks she can get away with it," he said. "Breathe out, tighten again. She's doing it deliberately. Horses know more than people give them credit for." Abby tightened the girth a second time. Esther turned her head and looked at her with one large brown eye. "I feel that way too," Abby told the horse quietly. Gideon made a sound that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. He killed it before it arrived. She noticed anyway. The lesson went for the better part of 2 hours. By the end, she could mount without assistance, sit without gripping the saddle horn like a woman expecting to fall, and stop the mare without sawing the reins the way she'd been doing the first 20 minutes. Gideon corrected her without condescension, which she appreciated more than she let show. He said what needed saying and stopped talking when it didn't. "Tomorrow we work on the posting trot," he said, when she'd unsaddled Esther and put her back. "Is that as unpleasant as it sounds?" "Worse," he said. And this time the near law came a little further out before he caught it. She decided not to comment on that either. She was learning what to leave alone. 3 days passed in that rhythm. The heat pressed down on Cedar Ridge like something with a grudge. The cattle moved slowly between the pastures, dull-eyed in the afternoon glare. The ranch hands, 3 of them, Gideon's part-time crew who'd come back from a lower pasture drive, watched Abby with varying degrees of curiosity and kept their opinions to themselves, which she respected. She cooked for the household because it needed doing, and she was competent at it. And she made clear by the manner in which she did it that she was contributing rather than complying. And after the first evening, the distinction seemed to register. On the 4th morning, she found a trunk in the corner of the main cabin, pushed against the wall, and asked Gideon what was in it. "Clothes wanting repair," he said. She opened it. She closed it. She opened it again. "How long have these been in here?" "A while. Some of these shirts have been torn since before last winter. I can see that." "You have been wearing torn shirts for months when there are perfectly repairable ones in a trunk 3 feet from where you sleep." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has never once considered this a problem worth solving. "I have other shirts," he said. "I can see the ones you're wearing them into the ground as well." She lifted a heavy canvas work shirt with a split seam along the entire right shoulder. Sit down. I'll do it now. You don't have to. She looked at him steadily. I'm choosing to, there's a difference. Wasn't that your point? He sat down. She repaired 4 shirts that morning, working with the particular efficient speed of a woman who has mended clothes since she was old enough to thread a needle. Gideon sat at the table and sharpened tools and didn't speak, which she had decided was his version of comfortable company. At one point, without looking up from the awl he was working with, he said, "You said your father had you keeping accounts for 7 years. Since I was 18, he paid you for that?" She paused over her stitching. "He provided for the household. That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Silence for a while. "You had no money of your own," he said. "Not a question. I had what he chose to give me, when he chose to give it." She pulled the thread through and knotted it. "That $100 he pressed into my hand the morning I left was the most money I'd held independently in my life." She looked up. "Until I counted the feed overpayment, I didn't know I could recover any of it for you. But I can if you want me to write to the supplier." Gideon looked at her. "Yes," he said, "write to him." She nodded and went back to the shirt. Neither of them said anything else, but something between them had changed again. Incrementally, the way things change when two people who started out as strangers in a forced circumstance begin to become, instead, people who know real things about each other. On the 5th day, Hollis Crane's men were seen on the North Ridge. One of the ranch hands, a quiet older man named Felix, who had the weather-reading instincts of spent 40 years outdoors, came in from checking the northern fence line and told Gideon, plainly and without alarm, that there were 2 riders sitting still on the ridge above the tree line, watching the ranch from a distance. Gideon listened. He asked 2 questions. How long had they been there? And were they moving toward the ranch or staying put? Felix said they'd been still for as long as he'd watched, which was maybe 20 minutes. Gideon thanked him and came inside. Abby was at the desk. She had heard. She looked up. 2 men on the North Ridge. Cranes. She set down her pen. So they know where I am. They know where the ranch is. That's not the same as knowing you're here, specifically. He crossed to the window that faced north and stood slightly to one side of it, looking up toward the ridge with the particular angled attention of a man who is used to not making himself an obvious silhouette. They're watching, not moving yet. What does watching mean? It means Crane isn't certain enough to come in. He needs confirmation of something before he moves. What kind of confirmation? Gideon was quiet for a moment. That you're here, or that your father sent something with you papers. Bonds something worth his trouble. Abby's hands went still on the desk. I wasn't carrying anything. My father gave me 1 bag with clothing and $100 and told me the driver would see me up. I believe you. But Crane doesn't know that. No. She thought about this. She thought about it, the way she had learned to think about her father's accounting from multiple directions at once, looking for the number that didn't add up rather than accepting the total she was given. My father wanted Crane to follow me here, she said slowly. Yes, I told you. No, I mean stopped. I understood that part. What I didn't understand until right now is that my father would have made certain Crane believed I was carrying something. Otherwise, Crane has no reason to follow a woman he doesn't know. Silas would have needed to make me worth following. She looked at Gideon. He told Crane I had something. He made me bait by making me look valuable. Gideon turned from the window. He looked at her with the expression she was learning to read as his version of being caught off guard by someone. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. Then Crane isn't going to stop watching this ranch. She straightened in the chair. Not until he either gets what he thinks I have or discovers I don't have it. And if he discovers I don't have it, he'll want to know where it is. And the fastest way to find out is to make you tell him. The sentence landed between them with all its implications fully intact. Abby pressed her hands flat on the desk. She breathed. 12 days, she said. The stage to Red Hollow won't help you if Crane's men are watching the approach roads, Gideon said quietly. I want to tell you otherwise, but I can't. She nodded. Once. Slowly. Then I'm not leaving in 12 days. Not safely. When I know more about what Crane has and what he's willing to do. And when we have a way to travel that doesn't put you on an open road with armed men between you and the next town. She stared at him. You said the decision was mine. It still is. His voice didn't waver. I'm telling you the conditions, so you can decide with real information. You want to ride for Red Hollow tomorrow. I'll get you the best horse I have and everything I can give you to make the trip. I won't stop you. But I think it's the wrong choice right now. And I'd rather you made it knowing that I think so. Abby looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the north window. She looked at the accounts spread across the desk. The careful order she had built out of 3 years of chaos. I'll stay, she said. Gideon nodded, but I want to know, she continued. Everything you know about Hollis Crane. Not pieces. Not what you think I'm ready to hear. All of it. He studied her face. Tonight, he said, after supper. She turned back to the accounts. I'll hold you to that, she said. He went back outside without another word. Felix, passing through, caught the tail end of it and gave Abby a look of quiet, uncomplicated respect that she felt, but didn't acknowledge because she had approximately 7 more columns to reconcile before she could allow herself to feel anything. She reconciled all 7. Then she started on the 8th. That evening, after the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the summer dark had brought the temperature down from murderous to merely punishing, Gideon told her what he knew about Hollis Crane. He told it across the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them. And Abby listened the way she had learned to listen to her father's business explanations, watching not just what was said but what was being positioned around. What was framed as fact and what was framed as assumption. Where the edges of certainty were. Crane worked for a consortium of Denver Railroad investors. He was not a marshal. He was not a lawman of any official designation. He was what people in certain parts of the territory called a resolution agent, which was a polite name for a man paid to recover money by whatever means discouraged future losses. He had worked this way for 7 years. He had a reputation for efficiency and for a particular kind of escalating pressure, starting with watching, moving to disruption, and moving to violence only when the calculation favored it. He's not impulsive, Gideon said. That's the thing that makes him dangerous. An impulsive man makes mistakes you can use. Crane thinks everything through. What does he want from my father specifically? Railroad bearer bonds. Negotiable. Worth several $1,000s. Abby went still. My father has railroad bonds? Your father apparently took bonds from a private railroad fund he was managing investments for. He was supposed to purchase land on the railroad's behalf. He pocketed the bonds instead and falsified the land purchase records. The air in the room felt different. He stole them, she said, yes. And Crane was hired to get them back, and to ensure no one who knew about them could testify otherwise. The last part of that sentence was where the real weight was. Crane doesn't just want the bonds, she said. He wants everyone who knows the bonds existed to stop being able to say so. Gideon held her gaze. That's how I read it. She set down her coffee cup. My father, she said, sent me here, knowing that the man looking for him would follow me. Believing I had the bonds or knew where they were. And intending that you and Crane would what? Fight over me? Kill each other. Her voice had gone very precise. The way it went when the numbers were adding up to something she hadn't wanted them to add up to. I think Silas wanted Crane to come to Cedar Ridge, Gideon said. He wanted you to be the thread that pulled Crane up this mountain. And he wanted to believe that he stopped. That you'd protect me, she said. Or that we'd destroy each other, Gideon said. Either way. He'd lose 2 problems instead of 1. Abby was quiet for a long time. The lantern on the table burned between them. Outside the cattle were still. The night wind came through the open window above the basin. carrying pine and dry grass and the particular summer smell of high country that she was beginning to recognize without having chosen to. "He planned it," she said. "Not impulsively. He looks that way. He's like Crane," she said. "In that way. He thinks everything through." Gideon didn't disagree. "Then my father," she said carefully, "calculated that his own daughter's life was an acceptable cost for his freedom." The sentence stood in the room. Gideon said nothing because nothing needed saying. The calculation was the calculation. The cost was the cost. Silas Whitlock had written it in his own handwriting and sent it up a mountain with a driver who didn't look back. Abby picked up her coffee cup. She finished it. She stood up. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me. You asked, you could have managed how much I heard." He looked up at her. "You told me you wanted all of it. A lot of people say that and then resent you for obliging." "I know," he said. "I gave it to you anyway." She stood there for a moment with the empty coffee cup in her hands. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because you're not someone who needs protecting from the truth about her own situation. You need the truth so you can think. Anyone who knows you for more than 2 days can see that." Abby stared at him. Then she set down the cup, said good night, and walked out to the bunkhouse before her face did something she hadn't given it permission to do. She pressed her back against the bunkhouse wall outside in the dark for 3 full minutes. Then she went inside. She did not sleep well, but it was a different kind of poor sleep than the first 2 nights. Less fear. More thought, the restlessness of a mind working through a problem instead of a mind bracing against something it couldn't control. That was progress. She decided to count it as such. The following week moved differently than the first days had. Abby began waking with the pre-dawn light and being at the desk by the time Gideon came in from the morning check of the herd. They had breakfast separately, and then by some unspoken mutual arrangement, began a loose collaboration on the ranch's practical needs that neither of them had proposed and both of them had apparently decided on independently. She wrote to the feed supplier, formally clearly, with the invoice discrepancies itemized and a request for either credit or return of the overpaid amount. She showed the letter to Gideon before she sealed it. He read it. He looked at her. "You want to soften it?" she asked. "No," he said. She sent it with Felix on his next trip to Red Hollow. She began tracking the weekly household supplies with the same system she'd used managing her father's household, everything documented. Everything dated, nothing assumed. Within the first week she had identified where provisions were being wasted, where they were being stretched too thin, and where Gideon was spending money on things he could source more cheaply from a different supplier 2 towns closer. When she told him, he stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the particular way of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. "How much?" he said. She told him the monthly figure. He was quiet. He looked at her. "I could reduce that expenditure in a week," she said. "Do it," he said. She did it in 5 days. He came in from the south pasture on the 5th day, and she handed him the revised accounting. He stood at the desk and looked at it for a long time. He didn't say thank you, but he came to supper that evening instead of eating outside alone, which he had apparently been doing for so long that the ranch hands looked at each other when he sat down at the table with the rest of them. Abby said nothing about it. She passed him the biscuits. He took 2 and ate both of them without commenting on their quality, which she took as a compliment, because she had burned the first 3 batches over that iron stove before she'd its particular personality. The ranch hands began talking to her, not all at once. It happened the way things happen in places where people are judicious with their trust, one small exchange at a time, testing the water before they put weight on it. Felix told her about the north pasture fence and where it had been giving trouble since last spring. A younger hand named Cord asked her if she'd be wanting any of the garden space near the south wall that nobody'd planted anything in since the previous fall. The third man, Holt, said almost nothing to her directly but started leaving his coffee cup near the basin after meals rather than carrying it away himself, which Felix quietly told her meant he'd accepted her presence in the kitchen. And apparently that mattered to Holt in ways that were not worth trying to fully understand. She planted tomatoes in Cord's offered garden space. In the brutal summer heat they would need regular watering. But there was a barrel near the south wall that caught what little rain came and could be supplemented from the creek. She planted them because she was planning, without fully admitting it to herself, to still be here when they were ready to eat. The day she planted the tomatoes, Gideon watched from the fence without saying anything. Later that evening he came to her with a roll of canvas and 2 lengths of wood. "What's that for?" "Shade," he said. "The afternoon sun hits that corner hard. Without shade the plants burn before they fruit." She looked at the canvas. She looked at him. "You built a shade frame," she said. "I cut the wood," he said. "You have to nail the canvas yourself or it won't be right." He held out the hammer. She took it. She built the frame wrong the first time and had to take it apart and reassemble it, which Gideon watched without comment except for one quiet correction about the angle on the second upright. When it was done, she stood back and looked at the rough, imperfect, entirely functional shade frame over her tomato plants. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel on a mountain ranch in the middle of a summer that had started as the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She felt like something here was hers. She pushed the feeling aside quickly because it was not useful. The stage would come through Red Hollow eventually. Crane's men might withdraw. She had a plan, and the plan had always been to leave. But the feeling had been there. She knew it had been there. That night she asked him about the shooting, not as a request. Exactly. More as the kind of question that follows naturally from a conversation about danger that had been ongoing for several days. "The revolver on the hook by the door," she said. "Is it loaded?" He was sitting by the window in the last of the day's light, working on something with his hands. She had noticed he always needed something to do with his hands when he was still. "Yes," he said. "Would you stop?" She tried again. "Could you teach me to use it?" He looked up. "Not because I intend to shoot anyone," she said, "but because you've explained to me multiple times in the past week that Crane's men are watching this ranch and that you cannot be in every place at once. And it seems to me that a woman in my current situation who cannot use a revolver is at a significant disadvantage that she could reduce with the right instruction." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I can teach you. Tomorrow morning?" "Before the heat gets bad," he said. 6 o'clock. She nodded. She went to the bunkhouse. She lay on her rope bed and looked at the ceiling and tried to sort through the architecture of what the past 10 days had built between herself and Gideon Mercer, because she was a woman who kept accounts, and it seemed important to know what the ledger said. He had not touched her. Not once. Not incidentally. Not in the way that men sometimes arrange accidental contact to establish proximity. He worked near her when the work required it, and maintained distance when it didn't. And the distance was always hers to adjust. He had not made decisions for her since the second day, when she had called him on doing exactly that, and the change had been immediate and genuine rather than performative. He had told her the truth when she asked for it, even when the truth was that she was being used as bait by her own father. He had built shade for her tomatoes without being asked. She stared at the ceiling. She was being ridiculous. She was 25 years old in a bunkhouse on a mountain ranch with Hollis Crane's men 2 ridges away. And she was doing arithmetic about a man she had known for less than 2 weeks. She closed her eyes. She opened them again. She thought about what he'd said. A man living angry at the dead has no business asking a woman to live beside him. She hadn't asked what he meant by it. She thought she knew. She thought knowing it mattered more than she was prepared to let on. 12 days had come and gone, and she was still here. She was still here because the road was dangerous, and the timing was wrong, and Crane's men were watching. And all of that was true. She told herself all of that was the whole truth. She fell asleep before she had to finish deciding whether she believed herself. The shooting lesson was efficient and unglamorous, and exactly what she'd needed. Gideon showed her the basics of the revolver, with the particular economy of a man who has no patience for ceremony. Load it this way. Hold it like this, not like that. Don't close your eyes. Closing your eyes is how you shoot your own horse. Breathe out before you pull. Don't pull. Press. She was terrible the first 6 shots. She was better the second 6. By the third set, she had put 2 out of 6 into the target, with something approaching intentionality. And Gideon said again, with a tone that was as close to approval as she'd heard from him on the subject of her frontier education. "I may not always be standing between you and trouble," he said. After the 4th round, she lowered the revolver. "I know," she said. "Knowing isn't the same as being prepared. I understand that now." She looked at the target, a piece of cut wood with a roughly marked circle on it. "I understand a lot of things now that I didn't understand 3 weeks ago." He took the revolver from her to reload it. "Your father," he said, without looking up, "kept you from knowing things deliberately. The accounts, your own financial situation, why he sent you here. He managed what you were allowed to understand, yes. That was not an accident." "No," she agreed. "A man who controls what a person knows controls what they believe is possible." "I understand that now, too." He handed the revolver back. She raised it. She pressed the trigger on the exhale. 3 out of 6 this time. He said nothing, but she saw him recalculate something in his expression. And she understood enough about him now to know it was recalculated upward. They had been back inside for less than an hour when Cord came to the door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that meant the news was not good. "Riders, Mr. Mercer," he said. "Not the ridge this time." Gideon was on his feet before the sentence was finished. "How close?" Felix counted 5. 5. Abby set down the pen she'd been holding. Gideon was at the hook by the door. Taking down the revolver, he checked it. He looked at her. "Bunkhouse," he said. "No." She stood. "I'm not. I need you inside with a door between you and 5 armed men while I find out what they want. That's not a decision about what's best for you. It's tactics." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She heard her own argument turned back on her. She went to the bunkhouse, but she left the window unlatched. She could hear the riders come into the yard. She could hear Gideon's voice, even and unhurried, asking what they wanted. She could not hear the answer clearly. Just the cadence of it, a voice she didn't recognize. Measuring and deliberate. It went on for several minutes. Then the sound of horses leaving. She was at the bunkhouse door when Gideon crossed the yard. His face had an expression on it she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Something cooler and more careful than anger. "What was it?" she asked. "One of Crane's men," he said. Not Crane himself. "What kind of message?" Gideon looked at her. "Crane knows you're here," he said. "He knows your name. And he says your father sent him a letter telling him that Abigail Whitlock was at Cedar Ridge carrying documentation of the bond transfer." The yard was very quiet. "My father," Abby said, "sent Crane a letter. To confirm you were here," Gideon said. "And to make certain Crane came for you directly rather than going back to Denver." She stood in the bunkhouse doorway, with the summer heat pressing down on both of them, and understood fully. For the first time, without any remaining reservoir of doubt, what her father had done. He hadn't just used her as a distraction. He had aimed Hollis Crane at her like a loaded gun and pulled the trigger from a safe distance. And he had done it while she was already here, already building shade frames and reconciling accounts, and learning to press a trigger on an exhale. And she hadn't known, and he had known she wouldn't know. She said nothing. She walked back inside. She sat at the desk. She picked up the pen. Her handwriting was steady when she started the next line of the ledger. It had taken her a while to realize that steadiness wasn't the absence of feeling. It was just what feeling looked like in a woman who had decided that going to pieces was not among her available options. Gideon came inside after a minute. He looked at her sitting at the desk with the pen moving across the ledger. "Abby," he said. "I know," she said without stopping. "I know what he did. I understand all of it now." She finished the line. She started the next, "And I'll deal with what I feel about it later. Right now, tell me what we're going to do about Crane." Gideon stood in the room with her for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from the desk and sat down. "Here's what I know," he said. She kept writing. "I'm listening," she said. Outside, the summer heat bore down on Cedar Ridge like something that intended to stay. The cattle moved slowly in the pasture. The tomato plants stood in their shade frame near the south wall, tenacious and green and growing despite everything. Inside the cabin, two people who had started as strangers in the worst possible circumstances sat across a desk from each other and began, for the first time, to plan together. The plan they made that evening was not complicated, because the best plans rarely are. Gideon had two things Crane wanted: information about the bonds and Abby herself. As long as Crane believed Abby carried something valuable, he would move carefully. A careful man was a predictable man. A predictable man could be managed. "He won't rush the ranch while he thinks I have documentation," Abby said. "If he damages what he's looking for, he loses his leverage with the railroad men." "Correct, so we have time." "Not much. But few days," Gideon said, "maybe a week. After that, he'll decide that waiting costs more than acting. Then we use the time to get ahead of him." She set down her pen. "What does Crane fear?" Gideon, "A federal marshal. A territorial deputy marshal. There's one who works out of Red Hollow, Warren Pike. Stern man. Crane operates in the spaces between the law, not against it directly. If Pike is officially involved, Crane pulls back. He can't afford a federal charge while he's working for railroad investors who pay politicians. Then we need Pike. Pike needs a reason to come up here. Crane hasn't technically broken a law on my property yet," Abby thought. "He delivered a threatening message. That's arguable. Crane's men poisoned the North Water Trough," she said. "Felix told me last week. He thought an animal had gotten into it. But it happened 2 days after the riders were seen on the ridge. And the timing." She stopped because of the look on Gideon's face. "You knew," she said. "I suspected. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to." He stopped. "To alarm me," she finished, "or to make the decision about what I was ready to hear." The silence between them had a shape to it. "I'm telling you now," he said. "Yes. After I figured it out myself." She held his gaze. "Gideon, I need you to stop deciding what parts of my situation I'm allowed to know. Every time you do that, you are doing exactly what my father did. Smaller scale, better intentions. Same architecture. That landed." She watched it land. He was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "Just that. No justification. No reduction of it. You're right. I'll stop. Thank you." "The trough," he said, "is enough to bring Pike up. Write to him tonight," she said. "I'll draft it if you want." "I'll write it," Gideon said. "But tell me what to say," she told him. Felix left before dawn with the letter tucked in his inside pocket, riding the long way around to avoid the south approach where Crane's men had been seen. He carried instructions to go directly to Pike's office in Red Hollow, wait for a reply, and bring it back regardless of how long it took. They had sent the letter. Now they waited, waiting. Abby was not a passive condition on Cedar Ridge. The ranch did not stop requiring work because armed men were watching it from ridges. Cattle still needed checking. Water still needed carrying. The iron stove still needed feeding every morning, regardless of what the morning held. She found the waiting almost easier to bear when her hands were occupied, which was something she had in common with Gideon. She realized they were both people who managed fear through motion. On the second morning after Felix left, Abby came out of the bunkhouse before dawn and found Gideon already at the corral fence, watching the north ridge with his coffee going cold in his hand. "Anything?" she asked. "Two riders on the ridge at first light." "Same position as before. She stood beside him at the fence. They're patient. Crane trains them to be. What kind of man trains men like that? Gideon drank his cold coffee. The kind who's never lost. She looked at the distant ridge. She couldn't see the riders from here, the morning light was wrong, but she knew they were there, the way you know something is behind you in a dark room. The knowledge lived in the body rather than the eyes. Have you lost? She asked before. He was quiet for a beat. Yes. What to my own anger, mostly. He set down the cup on the fence post. Spent a long time after Caleb died being so consumed with what Silas had done that I stopped seeing anything else. Lost 2 good years of work. Lost a partnership with a man I'd known since I was 20. Came close to losing this ranch. He paused. Anger is useful in small amounts. In large amounts it eats the person holding it and leaves nothing behind worth having. Abby was quiet. You don't seem angry now, she said. I'm not, at my father. No, why not? He killed your brother. He did. Gideon looked at the ridge. And I spent 15 years making sure I stayed angry about it so I wouldn't have to grieve instead. Anger felt like something. Grief felt like loss. He was quiet. I wrote Silas that letter because I was finally done being angry. I wanted him to account for what he did, not for me. For Caleb. Instead, I got you. The sentence was not accusatory. It was just the fact of what had happened, spoken plainly in the early morning light. I'm sorry, she said, for what my father did to Caleb. To you. That's not yours to carry, I know. But I'm sorry anyway. He looked at her. He looked away. Go eat something, he said. There's bread from yesterday, she went. But she carried that conversation with her through the whole long morning, turning it over the way you turn over something you picked up, without knowing why. Not yet certain of its value but unwilling to put it down. 3 days after Felix left, Cord came to the house at midday with his hat in his hands again. And this time, his face had the particular careful blankness of a young man delivering information he knows will change things. Crane had moved, not to the ranch, not yet. He had come down from the North Ridge and positioned himself, and at least 4 men at the junction of the Cedar Ridge Trail and the main track to Red Hollow, which was the only practical road off the mountain. He's not coming in, Gideon said, thinking aloud. He's cutting us off, Felix, Abby said immediately. Gideon looked at her. Felix went that way, she said. If Crane is at that junction, Gideon was already moving. He told Cord to saddle 2 horses. He told Holt to keep watch on the south approach. He came back through the cabin and took the revolver from the hook. I'm coming, Abby said. No. Felix went because I asked him to write that letter. If something has happened to him, riding into that junction will not improve it. Gideon checked the revolver with the quick practiced motion she had seen him use 100 times now. Fingers moving without thought. Stay inside. Keep the door barred. If you hear gunfire that doesn't stop within a minute, take Esther from the corral and ride straight south, not the main trail. The creek line. It's harder going, but they won't expect it. And if the gunfire does stop within a minute, then wait for me to come back. He held her gaze for one moment. She searched it for something she wasn't sure what. Reassurance, maybe. Or the specific kind of certainty that steady people project when they want you to believe everything is going to be all right. She didn't find that. She found honesty instead. Come back, she said. He went. The hour that followed was the longest of Abby's life to that point. And her life had recently offered some significant competition for that title. She barred the door. She did not hide. She sat at the desk with the second revolver. Gideon kept in the desk drawer. She had found it while organizing the papers and had not asked about it, and he had not mentioned it. A small mutual acknowledgement that it existed, and was there if she needed it, and she worked through the ledger because her hands needed occupation and her mind needed something to hold on to that wasn't pure fear. She heard nothing for 40 minutes. Then she heard horses. More than 2 horses. She was at the window before she'd made the conscious decision to move. Pressing herself to the side of the frame the way Gideon had shown her, looking out at the yard rather than silhouetting herself against the light. 4 horses. Felix on the second, sitting slightly crooked in the saddle, in the way of a man who is injured but managing. 2 other men she didn't recognize on the third and fourth, riding with the particular reluctant posture of men who have been strongly persuaded to go somewhere they'd rather not. She unbarred the door. Felix's left arm was wrapped in a cloth that had been someone's shirt. He was pale but upright, and when he saw her face, he shook his head in the small, precise way of a man who wants to communicate worse than it looks, before she had time to react to what it looked like. "Crane's man," Gideon said, coming off his horse. Not Crane himself. 2 of them decided Felix needed persuading to hand over the letter. He didn't hand it over, Felix said, with the flat satisfaction of a man reporting a fact he is quietly proud of. He did not, Gideon confirmed. He looked at Abby. "The letter is in Pike's hands." Felix made it through the junction before they closed it. "They caught him on the way back." She exhaled. "And these decided to ride with us voluntarily," Gideon said, in a tone that made the word voluntarily do a great deal of work. Crane's 2 men said nothing. They were not tied. They were simply sitting on their horses in the yard of Cedar Ridge Ranch, with expressions of men who had encountered something on that trail they had not adequately planned for. "What do we do with them?" she asked. "We offer them coffee," Gideon said, "and make clear that Hollis Crane does not own this mountain. And then we see if they'd like to reconsider their current employment." He said it pleasantly. Neither man argued with it. Abby stepped back from the doorway. "I'll put the coffee on," she said. She was not being domestic. She was buying time, and she knew Gideon knew it, and the small acknowledgement that passed between them in that moment, no words, just the recognition of shared strategy, was different from anything she could remember sharing with another person. She put the coffee on. She thought about that for the entire time it boiled. Felix's arm was cleaned and bound properly by that evening. The damage more surface than deep. One of Crane's men, the younger one, who turned out to be 23 and from Kansas and visibly regretting several recent decisions, told Gideon over his coffee that Crane had received additional communication from Denver. The railroad investors were pressuring him for resolution. The timeline had compressed. "How compressed?" Gideon asked. "He told us 3 days," the young man said. "After that he stops being careful. The room absorbed this." 3 days. Abby looked at the calendar she'd pinned near the desk 3 weeks ago. She had been marking the days in the automatic way of someone keeping track of how long until rescue. And somewhere in the past week, she had stopped thinking of the marks as a countdown and had started thinking of them simply as days. That shift in her own thinking had not been dramatic enough to notice at the time. But she noticed it now. 3 days. "Is Pike coming?" she asked. "The letter asked him to come," Gideon said. "I have no way to know if he will. What if he doesn't? Then we have 3 days to find another solution." She turned to the younger of Crane's 2 men. "You said Crane received communication from Denver. What kind of communication?" He looked uncertain about answering. "I'm not asking you to betray him for nothing," she said. "I'm asking because what you tell me might be the difference between this situation ending in a federal marshal's office or in a cattle yard with guns out. Which outcome is better for you is something only you can calculate." He looked at her. He looked at Gideon. He looked back at her. "The railroad men in Denver," he said slowly. "They found out Silas Whitlock is gone. Not just moving. Gone. He left Denver 3 days ago with a woman and a trunk, and nobody knows which direction." The room went absolutely still. Silas was running. Abby understood what that meant before anyone had to say it. If her father was running, he had accepted that Crane could not be managed anymore. He had decided that disappearing was cheaper than resolution. And if he disappeared, the only remaining trail to the bonds, the only person Crane could still put pressure on, was standing in this cabin. "He left me," she said, not with surprise, with the particular quiet of someone having a thing confirmed that they already knew, but had not quite allowed themselves to know completely. He's gone and he left me here for Crane to find. No one in the room said anything. Because there was nothing to say that the facts hadn't already said more efficiently. Gideon stood up. He crossed to the hook by the door and took down his gun belt, the full one. Not just the revolver. Cord, he said. Head the east pasture and bring in whoever's working out there. I want everyone on the ranch property by nightfall. Yes. Sir. Holt, check every water source, trough, barrel. The creek feed. Anything that looks touched, you tell me immediately. Yes. Sir. He looked at the two men from Crane's outfit. You two are going to make a choice tonight. You ride out and go back to Crane and tell him whatever you choose to tell him. Or you stay here and you keep your heads down, and when the federal marshal arrives you tell him what you know, and you walk out of this the honest way. He paused. I'd recommend the second option, but as I've recently been reminded, it's not my place to decide for other people. He didn't look at Abby when he said it. She felt it anyway. The younger man said, "We'll stay." The older one said nothing, which meant the same thing. Gideon nodded. He looked at Abby last. I need you to write something for me. What, everything, he said. What your father's letter said. What Crane's man told us today. Felix's account of what happened on the trail. The dates, the names, the sequence of events from the moment that wagon pulled up in my yard. He moved toward the door. If Pike comes, he needs a record that holds together. If he doesn't come, we still need it to exist. A sworn statement, she said. As close to one as we can make without a notary. I can do that. She was already reaching for paper. How much time do I have? Tonight, he said. As much of tonight as you need. He went out. She wrote. She wrote for 4 hours, working by lantern light at the desk while the ranch settled into its watchful night around her. She wrote everything she could remember with the precision of a woman who had kept accounts her entire adult life dates. Word spoken, name, sequence, cause and effect, the specific language of her father's letter, reconstructed as closely as she could render it from memory. She wrote Felix's account as he gave it to her in pieces over the course of the evening, asking him to stop and repeat and clarify until she was certain she had it right. She wrote the young Kansas man's account of Crane's communications from Denver, noting the things he was certain of and the things he was inferring. By the time the lantern needed trimming, she had 11 pages. She read them back. They were good, they were clear and specific, and they built a picture that was difficult to argue with. Because they were built from facts rather than emotion, and she had been careful to mark the places where she was working from memory versus from direct evidence. She folded them and tied them with a piece of string from the desk drawer. Gideon came in around 2 in the morning, moving quietly, and stopped when he saw her still at the desk. Done, she said, and held up the folded pages. He crossed to the desk and took them. He stood there and read, or at least reviewed. She could see his eyes moving quickly through the pages. The particular reading speed of a man checking structure rather than absorbing detail. When he finished, he set the pages down on the desk. This is better than I expected, he said. What did you expect? He looked at her. This is better than good. She was more affected by that than she had the energy to conceal at 2 in the morning after 4 hours of concentrated writing. So she simply accepted it without deflection. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to move fast. She stood up. Her back protested the hours at the desk. She gathered the pages and put them in the center desk drawer, which locked with a key that she handed to Gideon without being asked. Middle drawer, she said. He took the key. She went to the bunkhouse. She was asleep in under 3 minutes, which was something she had not managed since the wagon drove away 3 weeks ago. She didn't know that was meaningful until she woke up and realized it. Tomorrow moved fast, exactly as Gideon had predicted. It began at dawn with the smell of smoke, not the cookfire smell of morning biscuits on an iron stove. Something wider, drier, the smell that had no benign explanation in late summer on a ranch sitting in the middle of 100 square miles of grass that hadn't seen proper rain in 6 weeks. Abby came out of the bunkhouse and the sky to the west was not right. It was brown. Brown the way the sky goes when what's burning is not a campfire or a lamp or a careless coal but an actual portion of the world. Gideon was at the corral, and the horses were already telling him everything moving in tight circles. Ears flat, the whites of their eyes showing. Cattle in the south pasture had gone from their morning graze to a loose, restless drift toward the eastern fence. "How far?" she asked. "West pasture," he said. "Wind is driving it east, toward the ranch." "Cord," Gideon called. Cord came running from the barn. "Get the men. We need a firebreak along the west line, not the fence itself. The scrub on the near side. We pull everything dry and we do it now. How wide a break? Wide as we can make it in the time we have." Cord ran. Gideon looked at Abby. "I know," she said. Inside no. He said it with the clipped focus of a man thinking 4 steps ahead. "I need you to get every water barrel on the ranch filled and positioned along the south face of the main cabin. If the break doesn't hold, I need options." She absorbed this. "That's not keeping me inside," she said. "No," he said. "It's giving you a job that matters." He was already moving. She moved too. She worked the pump at the pace a person works when they understand that pace is not optional. Barrel by barrel, she and the young Kansas man, whose name turned out to be Henry, which seemed insufficient for his size, but was what he offered, filled and rolled every water container on the ranch property to the south face of the cabin. Holt showed her where the second pump was, behind the woodshed, and they worked both simultaneously until the line of barrels along the south wall was the most water Abby had ever arranged in one place in her life. The smoke thickened. She could hear the fire now, the particular dry crackle of grass burning in volume. A sound like paper being shredded very quickly and very close. The horses in the corral were screaming. She hadn't known horses screamed until this moment. It was not a sound she would forget. "The horses," she said to Henry. Mr. Mercer said, "The horses will break the fence in 10 minutes if they're not let out." She was already moving toward the corral gate. "They won't run into the fire. Animals don't run into fire. But they'll injure themselves getting out of that corral." Henry followed her. She opened the gate. 6 horses poured through it and ran east. Away from the smoke, exactly as she'd predicted, their hooves throwing up dry dust in a cloud that merged with the smoke drifting across the yard. She turned back, and that was when she saw a crane. Not on the ridge. Not at a distance. He had come from the north, opposite the fire, and he'd brought 2 men with him. And they had ridden in while everyone's attention was west, and the smoke was providing better cover than any plan he could have arranged himself. Hollis Crane was 44 years old and built like a man who had never once done a thing that didn't serve a purpose. He had a flat, neutral face that gave nothing away. The face of a man who had long ago decided that expression was a liability. He was not pointing a gun, he didn't need to. The 2 men behind him had that covered. He looked at Abby the way a man looks at a thing he has been looking for. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "your father said you'd be reasonable." "My father," Abby said, with a steadiness that surprised her more than it probably should have by now, said a great many things. Most of them were untrue. Crane studied her. "Where are the bonds?" "I don't have them," father said. "My father lied to you." She held his gaze. The smoke was getting heavier. Behind her she could hear the fire crew working the brake. "My father lied to everyone. He lied to Gideon Mercer about what my coming here meant. He lied to me about why I was coming, and he lied to you when he told you I was carrying documentation." She didn't move back. "He used me as bait to draw you here, whatever debt he owes you. He is now 3 days gone and running, and I am the only thing standing in this yard." Crane was quiet. He was thinking. She could see him doing it, the particular stillness of a calculating mind running numbers. "You have nothing," he said. "I have a sworn account of everything your men have done on and around this property for the past 3 weeks. Property crimes, Felix's injury, the poisoned water trough. I also have the testimony of 2 of your men who chose different employment yesterday. She paused. And Deputy Marshal Warren Pike is currently riding up from Red Hollow. Something moved in Crane's face. Not much, barely at all. But something. You're bluffing, he said. I'm accounting, she said. There's a difference. Ask anyone who's seen my ledger. She heard it then. From beyond the north tree line, the sound of horses on the main trail, moving at pace, not the lazy walk of men out for a morning ride, but the purposeful canter of people with somewhere to be and a time they intended to be there. Crane heard it too. His head turned toward the trail. His jaw tightened in the particular way of a man recalculating. Then everything happened at once. From behind the barn, Gideon came around the corner at a dead run, not from the west where the fire was, but from the eastern side, where he'd apparently been moving for the last several minutes. Reading the yard the way a man reads terrain he's worked for years. He took in Crane and the two armed men, and Abby standing between them in the time it takes to blink, and his hand went to the gun at his hip. Crane, he said, flat as a stone. Crane looked at him. The two armed men looked at Gideon. The sound of horses on the trail got louder. Abby did not move. She understood, in the sharp crystalline clarity of a moment that compresses a great deal of thinking into very little time, that what happened in the next 30 seconds depended entirely on nobody doing the wrong thing, and that the most dangerous person in the yard was not Crane or Gideon or the two armed men, but the fire still burning in the wet pasture and the smoke that was making everyone's eyes water and their patience thin. You have about 90 seconds, she said to Crane, before Marshal Pike rides into this yard and you are standing in it with two guns drawn on a woman. Crane looked at her. One question, he said. Just one. Answer it honestly and I'll be out of this yard before he gets here. She waited. Did your father tell you anything about where the bonds are? Anything at all? Before you left Denver? She looked at him. She thought about her father pressing $100 into her hand and telling her the driver would see her safely. She thought about Silas Whitlock straightening his collar in the mirror. She thought about what he had written in the letter that had started all of this. You may keep her as wife, housekeeper, or servant as suits your needs. No, she said. My father told me nothing. He never told me anything that might have given me a reason to refuse him. Crane looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he looked at Gideon. Then he looked at the trail, where the sound of horses had become unmistakable. He turned his horse. He rode north. His two men followed. Gideon crossed the yard in long strides and reached her as the first rider came through from the trail, Warren Pike on a gray horse, with two deputies behind him, all three of them looking at the smoke and at the yard, and at Gideon and at Abby, with the careful, comprehensive attention of men trained to read a situation by what it contains rather than what people tell them about it. Pike looked at Abby. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the North Trail, where dust from Crane's departure was settling. I'm guessing, Pike said, that I'm about 4 minutes late. 3, Abby said. Pike looked at her more carefully. And you are? Abigail Whitlock. She reached into her dress pocket and produced the folded papers, tied with string. I have an 11-page sworn account of the events on this property over the past 3 weeks. I'd like you to read it. Pike took the papers. He looked at them. He looked at her. You wrote this yourself? Yes. Sir. When last night? Took about 4 hours. He untied the string. He began reading, and behind them the fire break held. Gideon had built it wide enough, and the wind shifted just enough, and the line of dry scrub they'd pulled and the dirt they'd turned kept the fire on the west side of the fence line and away from the barn and the cabin and the patient row of water barrels along the south wall that Abby had filled one pumpload at, a time through the first terrible hour of the morning. The fire burned itself out by noon. The horses came back on their own by mid-afternoon, walking in from the east in a loose group, unhurried now that the smoke was thin and the air was safe. And Abby was at the corral fence when they came, and she opened the gate and let them file back in one by one. Gideon stood beside her. They watched the last horse, Esther. Of course, always the last one, and walk back into the corral and drop her head to the water trough. The fire break, Abby said. We built it, he said. She looked at him. Corden Holt and Felix and Henry, she said. And you. I filled water barrels. You filled water barrels, he agreed. While Crane was standing 10 feet from you with 2 armed men behind him, he paused. That wasn't filling water barrels, Abby. She looked at the corral. I was terrified, she said. I know. My hands were shaking the entire time. Mine too, he said. She looked at him. His hands looked entirely steady. I'm serious, he said, and his voice was steady too. But he held up his right hand and she could see, if she was looking carefully, the faint residual tremor of a man whose adrenaline had not entirely finished with him yet. She was looking carefully. She reached out and put her hand over his. Not romantically, not with any declaration, just contact. The kind of contact two people make when they have been through something together, and the words for it haven't been invented yet. He turned his hand over under hers. Just that. Neither of them said anything. Esther drank her water. The smoke thinned to nothing in the afternoon wind. Marshal Pike read all 11 pages. Pike finished reading on the porch steps, with the afternoon light going long and the last of the smoke thinning to nothing over the west pasture. He read slowly, the way careful men read things that matter, turning back twice to check something in an earlier page against something in a later one. When he finished, he retied the string, held the document on his knee, and looked at Abby. You wrote this from memory, he said. Yes, sir. The language in your father's letter, you're certain of the wording? I read it 3 times standing in that yard, she said. I have not forgotten a word of it. Pike looked at Gideon. You still have the letter. In the desk, Gideon said. Middle drawer. It's yours. Pike stood up. He was a tall man, spare in the way of someone who had spent decades outdoors, with a face that had done a great deal of weather and emerged from it without complaint. He looked at Abby the way she had noticed. He looked at most things not unkindly, but with the particular reserve of a man who has learned that first impressions cost him nothing to withhold. Miss Whitlock, he said, what you did in that yard this morning, standing your ground in front of Hollis Crane, that was either very brave or very reckless. I haven't decided which yet. Neither have I, she said honestly. Something moved in Pike's expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The account you've given me is enough to pursue Crane on federal property interference and the assault on your ranch hand, he said. Whether it's enough to hold him depends on what his men are willing to say under formal questioning. He paused. The 2 who stayed here last night. Henry and the other one, Abby said. Henry's the one who'll talk. The other one will follow whatever Henry decides. You read people fast, Pike said. I kept my father's house for 7 years, she said. You learn. Pike took the document inside to retrieve Silas's letter. And while he was in there, Gideon came to stand beside Abby at the fence with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without being asked. She took it. He's going to go after Crane, she said. And my father. Gideon drank his coffee. If he can find him. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The afternoon had cooled marginally, and the burn smell from the west pasture was beginning to be replaced by the ordinary smell of the ranch horses. Pine, dry earth, the faint green of the creek somewhere below the north fence. She had been here long enough to know what Cedar Ridge smelled like without smoke. She noticed that she knew this the way you notice something that has been true for a while, before you paid attention to it. What happens to the ranch, she asked, if all of this the testimony? The letter Crane's men talking to Pike, what happens here after it's done? Gideon looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, this was your life before any of this happened. Your cattle, your records, your fence lines that need mending. She turned to look at him. I came here in a wagon and broke things open. I want to know if it can be put back. Some things can be put back, he said. Some things don't go back. They just go forward different. She wasn't certain if he was talking about the ranch. She suspected he wasn't only talking about the ranch. I owe you wages, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon. For the accounts. The household management. The supplier letter that recovered real money. He looked straight ahead at the corral. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. What your work is worth. Calculated honestly, I owe you a fair wage for it. She stared at him. In her entire life, no one had calculated what her work was worth and offered to pay her for it. Not her father. Not any man who had benefited from the management she provided so quietly that most people forgot to notice it was work at all. You don't owe me, I do, he said flatly. Don't tell me I don't. I kept accounts poorly for 3 years, and you fixed it in 3 weeks. That has a value. I know what I pay men for work that matters less. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. They drank their coffee. Pike came back out with the letter and 2 pages of his own notes and told them he'd be riding back to Red Hollow before dark with Henry and the other man, who had given formal statements to Pike's deputies in the barn over the past hour. He would pursue Crane through federal channels. He would also file a report on Silas Whitlock's activities that would go to the Denver Territorial Office. Will they find him? Abby asked. My father. Men running from several directions at once tend to make mistakes, Pike said. He'll surface somewhere. They always do. He looked at her carefully. When they find him, Miss Whitlock, there will likely be a formal proceeding. Your testimony will be relevant, I understand. It may require you to travel to Denver. I understand that too. Are you prepared for that? She thought about what it meant. Standing in a courtroom and saying in public what she had written in 11 pages. Saying it about her father. Looking at Silas Whitlock across a legal proceeding and being the instrument of the accounting he had spent his entire life avoiding. Yes, she said. Pike studied her one more moment. Then he nodded, put on his hat and went to collect his deputies. The yard was quiet after they rode out. The ranch hands drifted back to their evening routines with the particular ease of men for whom crisis is a weather a catastrophe, something that comes and passes and leaves work behind it that simply needs doing. Felix, his arm properly bound, supervised the trough repair from a fence post with a tin cup and a running commentary that nobody asked for, and everybody seemed to appreciate. Abby stood in the middle of the yard and felt the day leaving her body all at once. The way exhaustion arrives after the emergency has passed, and the muscles that were holding everything together remember that they have been holding everything together. Gideon watched her from the porch. Eat something, he said. In a minute now, he said, not harshly, just with the directness of a man who can see that she is about 30 seconds from sitting down on the ground involuntarily. She came inside. She sat at the table and ate bread and dried beef and the last of the morning's biscuits, which were past their best but edible, and drank 2 cups of water because the smoke and the pump work and the stained terror of the morning had apparently taken more out of her than she'd noticed while they were happening. Gideon sat across from her. He didn't eat. He just sat there with his forearms on the table, not talking. And she understood that he was doing the thing she had seen him do when the ranch hands were unsettled after the cattle drive, providing presents rather than words, which was its own kind of care. She ate everything on the plate. She looked at him. Your side, she said. He looked down. There was blood on the left side of his shirt, a spreading stain below the rib line that had apparently been there for some time based on the color of it. Gideon, it's not, she said, and was already up and around the table. Take off the vest. Abby, it's a take off the vest or I'll take it off for you. She was already at the basin. Finding the cloth and the bottle of spirits, Gideon kept in the cabinet that she had originally catalogued as a supply item and now recognized as a medical necessity, given how he apparently managed his own injuries. When did this happen? During the firebreak work, he said, which told her nothing specific and everything general about the fact that he had been bleeding for the better part of 4 hours and had not mentioned it. Why didn't you say something? He had the vest off now. The shirt beneath had a tear in it along the left side that had not been made by a fence nail. There were other things happening, he said. Crane's man shot you. Grazed, he said. There's a difference. She looked at the wound, which was a graze in the technical sense of the word, and a serious thing in every practical sense. She had cleaned worse. Her father had a talent for small domestic injuries and an absolute aversion to dealing with them himself, and she had the necessary supplies and the necessary steadiness, and she worked efficiently. The way she worked when the work required her, not to feel things until after it was finished. He sat still for all of it. He made no sound. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at him and said, "Next time you are shot, you will tell me." "Next time," he said. "I'll try not to get shot." "Both," she said. He looked at her. There were approximately 4 inches between them, and it was the middle of the evening, and the lantern was on, and neither of them moved. "You should have told me," she said, and her voice had gone quieter than she intended. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She stepped back. She gathered the cloth and the bottle and returned them to the places, and told herself that the particular feeling currently residing in her chest was simple relief that the wound was not serious, and that it had nothing to do with the 4 inches that had existed between them a moment ago, and that she was a sensible woman with an excellent grasp of her own situation. She believed approximately a third of this. She went to the bunkhouse. She did not sleep well, but it was the restlessness of too much thought rather than fear, which was a different problem entirely, and one she was accustomed to solving by morning. By morning she hadn't solved it, but morning brought its own immediate requirements, and she set the unsolved thing aside and got up and put the coffee on. The following weeks remade Cedar Ridge in ways that were both practical and invisible. Crane's men did not return. Pike sent word through Felix that Hollis Crane had been formally served with a federal notice of investigation, which meant he was currently occupied with lawyers in Denver rather than with mountain ranches in the high country. The immediate danger had not dissolved. Pike was explicit that Crane was careful and patient, and would not simply accept a federal notice as a conclusion, but it had stepped back. And stepping back was enough. The ranch breathed. Abby ran it. Not because Gideon was unable to. He was up and working within 2 days of the shooting, which was not a medical recommendation, but was also entirely unsurprising to everyone who knew him, but because the system she had built over the past weeks had become load-bearing in ways that neither of them had explicitly planned. The accounts were current. The supplier relationships were documented. The household ran on a schedule that had reduced waste and improved the quality of daily life for everyone on the property. And the ranch hands had quietly accepted this, the way practical people accept things that make their lives better without requiring them to admit it. She negotiated with the feed supplier herself when he sent a letter contesting her initial claim. She wrote back with the invoice discrepancies laid out in 3 columns: date, stated amount, actual delivery, and suggested he review his records before responding. He sent a credit 2 weeks later. She showed the credit confirmation to Gideon at the desk. He read it. He looked at her. 3 columns, he said. "It's clearer that way. I would have ridden to town and argued with him in person, and probably gotten less and spent a day doing it." He looked at the paper again. "Yes," he said, without any particular reluctance. "Probably." She took the paper back and folded it. He watched her file it. "The horse operation," he said. She looked up. "I've been thinking about expanding it," he said. "There's a market for trained quarter horses from the high country. Better stock than what comes off the eastern plains. I've had interest from 3 buyers in the last year and turned them all away because I didn't have the management capacity. You have it now," she said. "I would need someone to handle the contractual correspondence," he said. "Buyer agreements, delivery terms, payment schedules. That's account management." "Yes, I can do that." "I know you can." He was looking at the window. Not at her. "I'm asking if you want to." She understood the distinction. He was not assigning her a task. He was not managing her toward a useful purpose. He was asking if this was something she chose. "Yes," she said. "I want to." He nodded once. "I'll write to the first buyer this week," he said. She filed the last paper. "Gideon," he looked at her. "Why did you never expand it before?" "The horse operation." If you had interested buyers, because managing contracts requires someone who can sit still long enough to write them properly, he said. I'm better with the horses than the paper. That's what I'm for, she said. And then stopped, because the way that had come out was not quite what she'd meant. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. Among other things, neither of them elaborated on what the other things were. She went back to the ledger. He went back outside. She stared at the ledger page for approximately 90 seconds before she was able to focus on the numbers. 12 days after Pike's visit, a letter arrived from the Denver Territorial Office. Felix brought it in with the weekly supply run and handed it to Abby because she was the one at the desk when he came through the door and Gideon was out with the horses. She looked at the seal official, government stamped, the kind of envelope that arrived when something had been decided by people with authority to decide things. She set it on the desk. She looked at it. She picked it up and went to find Gideon. He was at the North Corral, working with a young roan that had been giving him trouble on the lead. He saw her coming, and something in the way she was holding the letter made him hand the lead rope to Cord without being asked. He took the envelope. He read it. He read it again. What does it say? She asked. He looked up. They found your father. The world went very still. Where? Tucson. He was trying to cross into Mexico with a woman in a trunk. As reported. He looked back at the letter. He's in federal custody. The bonds were in the trunk. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. Her father, in federal custody in Tucson, the bonds found. The crime documented. They want me in Denver, she said. For the proceeding. Yes. 6 weeks. She counted backward and forward from that in her head, the way she counted everything practically, in terms of what it meant for what was already in motion. The horse operation correspondence she'd just begun. The autumn supply orders she'd been planning. The accounts for the third quarter that she'd wanted to have finalized before the cold came. I can be ready, she said. Gideon folded the letter. He looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to read, as him working through something he wasn't certain how to say. What? She asked. You'll go to Denver, he said. You'll testify. That proceeding, it will be the legal end of it. He paused. After that, there's nothing keeping you here. The statement sat between them in the afternoon heat. I'm aware of that, she said carefully. I want to be clear, he said. That I'm not, that nothing here is meant to. He stopped. Try it again. You've built something real here, Abby. In the accounts and the management and the way this ranch runs now. That was your work. And when this is over, you'll have options you didn't have when you arrived. And I want you, she said. He stopped. Are you trying to tell me I'm free to leave? I'm trying to tell you that you always were. I know that. She held his gaze. I've known that for a while. Then he looked at the letter in his hands. I'm trying to tell you that whatever you decide, I want it to be what you actually want. Not what circumstances made convenient. She looked at him for a long moment. We'll discuss that, she said, after Denver. Something moved in his face. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. All right, he said. She turned back toward the cabin. She had 3 steps behind her when he said her name. She turned. The letter to the buyer in Santa Fe, he said. 3rd paragraph. You wrote that delivery would be guaranteed within the month of agreement. I think that should say within 6 weeks of agreement. She had put 12 feet between them by then, and she looked back at him across those 12 feet with the sun coming down at the angle it came at this time of afternoon, turning everything the particular amber color that she now associated specifically with Cedar Ridge and no other place she had ever been. I'll revise it, she said. He nodded. She went back inside. She sat at the desk and revised the letter and told herself she was not smiling and was largely unconvincing on this point. The weeks before Denver were not quiet. Quiet was not a condition Cedar Ridge offered in any season. And late summer moving toward early autumn brought its own sustained list of requirements. The western pasture fire had damaged fence line that needed rebuilding. 3 horses needed training that Gideon had deferred during the crisis weeks. The autumn feed order required sourcing from 2 different suppliers, now that Abby had restructured the purchasing arrangements, which was more efficient and required more coordination. She did not experience this as burden. She experienced it as hers. That distinction had arrived so gradually that she couldn't have named the moment when it had shifted. Somewhere between the tomato plants and the 11-page document, and the morning she had stood in the yard while Crane's men held guns and told the truth clearly enough that a federal marshal believed it, somewhere in there, Cedar Ridge had stopped being the place she was temporarily surviving and had become the place she worked. There was a difference. It was a significant difference. She thought about it in the evenings while she updated the ledger, and Gideon sat nearby doing things with his hands in the companionable silence that had become their version of conversation when the day's work was done. One evening he said, without looking up from the bridle he was oiling, "Your mother's mirror. The cracked one," he said. "In the bunkhouse. I noticed the frame is pulling apart. The clasp broke when the suitcase was dropped," she said. "I can repair it," he said, "if you want." She was quiet a moment. "That mirror was my mother's. I know. It was already cracked when it arrived, I know." He didn't look up. "A cracked mirror in a good frame is still worth keeping." She looked at him across the table. He was still looking at the bridle. She understood, without any ambiguity whatsoever, that he was not talking about the mirror. "Yes," she said, "please repair it." He nodded once. He repaired it 2 days later, bracing the frame with a thin strip of ash wood and a precise application of glue that she watched him apply with the same careful attention he gave to anything that required getting right. He handed it to her without ceremony. She held it. The glass was still cracked, split diagonally from corner to corner, both halves reflecting slightly different angles, but the frame held firm and the repair was clean, and it was, she thought, the most honest mirror she had ever used, the kind that shows you exactly what's there without any pretense of wholeness. "Thank you," she said. He went back outside. She held the mirror a while longer. Then she put it in the cabin. Not the bunkhouse. The cabin. She didn't remark on this, and neither did he, but the next morning when she came out of the cabin at dawn with her coffee, Gideon was at the pump, and he glanced at the cabin door behind her, and then at her, and said nothing at all. And the nothing had the quality of a man who has noted something important and chosen not to make it larger than it is. She drank her coffee at the fence beside him. They watched the cattle move in the early light. 2 weeks until Denver, she said. Yes. The third quarter accounts will be finalized by then. I know. The Santa Fe buyer confirmed the delivery terms. I saw your letter. She turned her cup in her hands. Gideon. When I come back from Denver, she stopped. He waited. She had started the sentence without being entirely certain how it ended, which was unusual for her. She was a woman who knew what she meant to say before she said it. The ledger in her head was always current, except apparently not on this particular topic. I'd like to discuss the horse operation, she said finally. Formally, what a continued arrangement looks like. Responsibilities, compensation, terms. He turned to look at her. A formal arrangement, he said. Yes, like a business agreement. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. All right, she said. They turned back to the cattle. The morning light came over the ridge and hit the ranch in the particular way it hit in September. Lower and warmer, and somehow more deliberate than the summer blaze had been. And the cattle moved through it slowly, and the horses were quiet in the corral, and somewhere on the south wall, the tomato plants were doing exactly what tomato plants do when they're properly shaded and watered and tended through a difficult summer. They were bearing fruit. It was 2 mornings before Denver. With the travel arranged and the ranch affairs in order, and Abby's single bag packed with considerably more practical content than it had held when she'd first arrived, good boots now, a hat, her ledger, her mother's repaired mirror, that the rider came down the main trail. Not Crane, not Pike. She saw the horse first through the north window and recognized neither the animal nor the rider. And then the rider came closer, and she felt the particular cold recognition of a person who has spent a long time not thinking about something and then sees it made concrete and unavoidable. Her father had not crossed into Mexico. Her father was here. Silas Whitlock rode into the yard of Cedar Ridge Ranch, looking 15 years older than he had looked when he'd pressed $100 into her hand and told her the driver would see her safely. And alongside him, with the wary expression of a man who has made a professional calculation he is not entirely comfortable with, was Warren Pike. Gideon came out of the barn. He saw Silas. Every muscle in his body went still in the way that controlled men go still when they are working very hard at being controlled. Abby was already on the porch. Silas looked at her with an expression she had not expected and could not immediately name. Not guilt, not calculation, something that might, in a man with different history, have been called grief. Abigail. She said nothing. Pike dismounted. Miss Whitlock, he asked to see you before the formal proceeding. I allowed it because I believed you'd want the chance to speak. He paused. You don't have to. She looked at her father on his horse. She looked at the ranch behind her, the repaired fence line. The south garden, the water barrels still positioned along the wall. From the morning she'd filled them, while cranes stood 10 feet away. Get down, she said to her father. Silas dismounted. He was smaller than she remembered, or she was larger. She couldn't decide which, and it didn't matter. He came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. I need you to know, he said, that I never intended. Stop, she said. He stopped. You're going to tell me you didn't intend for us to go this way, she said. You're going to tell me you thought Gideon would keep me safe. You're going to tell me you were desperate and afraid, and you made choices that a better man wouldn't have made. She held his gaze. And most of that will even be true, he nodded slowly. None of it, she said, changes what you wrote in that letter. Silas closed his eyes. You wrote that a man could keep me, she said, her voice still level. Still precise, still the voice she used when the numbers had to be right. As wife or servant or housekeeper, as suits his needs. You wrote that and you signed it, and you sent it with a stranger in a wagon, and you didn't look back. He opened his eyes. They were wet. I know, he said. I want you to say it, she said. Not I know. Say what you did. Behind her, she could feel Gideon on the porch. Not moving, not intervening, giving her the space to do what needed doing. Silas Whitlock looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said it, all of it, not the excuses around it. The thing itself named plainly, in the particular language of a man who has finally run out of room to stand anywhere else. When he finished, Abby was quiet. Then she said, I hope someday you understand that being my father never made you my owner. She stepped back. She looked at Pike. I'll testify, she said. In whatever proceeding is required, I will say everything I know and everything I have documented. She paused. Take him. He guided Silas back to his horse. Silas went without resistance, which was the first voluntary thing Abby had ever seen him do that didn't serve his own immediate interest. And she stood on the porch and watched him go and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not grief exactly, something quieter than both of those. Something that lived in the space where a long-held weight used to be. Gideon's hand came to rest on the porch railing beside her, not touching her. Just there, the way his presence had been there through all of it. You all right? He asked. She breathed in the September air, which smelled of pine and dry grass, and the particular clean note of a ranch after rain, because it had rained 2 nights ago, the first proper rain since she'd arrived. And the ground was still carrying it. Yes, she said. She meant it. Denver was louder than Abby remembered. She had lived there for 25 years, and in 6 weeks she had been gone. The city had not changed at all. The same streets. The same storefronts, the same particular quality of noise that a city produces when too many people are conducting too many different kinds of business in too small a space. But she had changed, and the city felt wrong the way a coat feels wrong when you've lost weight wearing it. still technically yours, but no longer the right shape. She stayed at a boarding house 2 blocks from the territorial courthouse. Pike had arranged it. The room was clean, and the landlady was a practical woman who asked no questions and provided coffee at 5 in the morning without being asked, which Abby appreciated more than almost anything else about Denver in those 2 weeks. She testified on the 4th day. She had expected to be afraid. She had prepared for fear the way she prepared for everything, by knowing the material so thoroughly that emotion had nowhere to insert itself between her and the facts. She had her 11 pages. She had the letter. She had the supplier credit documentation, and the account records, and the precise chronological account of every event Frobwagen, pulling up in Gideon's yard to the morning Pike had ridden out with her father. What she had not prepared for was how small Silas looked. He was seated at a table across the room from the witness stand, flanked by a lawyer and a territorial officer, and he looked like a man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had finally put it down not by choice, but because his arms had given out. He looked diminished, not villainous, just used up. The men who spend their lives running from themselves tend to end up. She looked at him once. Then she looked at the man asking her questions and answered every single one of them clearly, specifically, and without any emotional decoration that might give a lawyer something to work with. She was on the stand for 2 hours. When she stepped down, Pike was waiting near the back of the room. He said nothing. He simply handed her a glass of water, which told her everything she needed to know about how she looked at that moment, despite how she felt. She drank the water. She walked outside. She stood on the courthouse steps in the Denver morning and breathed the city air, which smelled of horses and coal smoke and commerce, and thought about what the air smelled like on Cedar Ridge in September. And the thought was so specific and so physical: pine, dry earth, the faint green of the creek, that it felt less like a memory and more like a direction. She knew, standing on those courthouse steps, what she was going to do. She had known for a while. The knowing had arrived not as a dramatic decision but as a quiet accumulation of evidence. The way good accounting always works, one fact at a time, each one small, the total unmistakable. She went back to the boarding house and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the feed supplier in Colorado Springs, informing him that Cedar Ridge Ranch would be continuing their adjusted purchasing arrangement through the winter season and requesting confirmation of autumn pricing. The second was to a woman she had known in Denver, a former schoolmate named Clara who ran a small bookkeeping service and had once offered Abby work if she ever needed it. In the letter, Abby declined the standing offer with genuine warmth and explained that she had found other employment, and she described the horse operation correspondence work in enough detail to make it sound like the real professional undertaking it actually was. Because it was, and she had built it, and she wanted Clara to understand that. She sealed both letters. She mailed them the next morning. She spent the remaining days in Denver doing 3 things: attending the final sessions of the proceeding, visiting her mother's grave on the eastern edge of the city, and purchasing a set of proper account ledgers that she had identified as superior to the ones currently in use at Cedar Ridge, and that she had wanted since she'd first opened Gideon's chaotic supply crate 6 weeks ago. At the grave she said what she had come to say, which was between herself and her mother and the September wind moving through the cemetery pines. And she left feeling lighter than she'd arrived, which was what she had hoped for. At the proceedings' final session, the territorial judge found sufficient evidence to refer Silas Whitlock to federal prosecution on charges of fraud, false instrument, and conspiracy in the theft of railroad bonds. The bonds themselves had been recovered from the trunk. Hollis Crane, faced with the testimony of 2 of his own men plus Abby's documented account, had negotiated a reduced federal charge in exchange for testimony about the railroad investors who had hired him, which Pike had described to Abby as the most efficient outcome available and which she had accepted as the practical resolution it was. Silas looked at her when the judge finished reading. She looked back. She had nothing left to say to him that she hadn't already said in Gideon's yard. She had said it clearly, and she had meant it, and she had let it stand as the final word between them. She stood up and walked out of the courthouse. She had a stage to catch. The ride back took 2 days, with a night stop at a way station that smelled of woods and other people's weariness, and served coffee that was technically coffee. In the way that certain arguments are technically logical, the form was there, but the substance was missing. She drank it anyway. She spent both days of the ride with the new ledgers in her lap, tabbing the pages and labeling the sections the way she had planned since she'd bought them, building the structure for the fourth quarter before she arrived to fill it in. It was not the most conventional way to spend a stage journey. The only other passenger, a rancher from the eastern plains, watched her for about an hour before apparently deciding she was a very dedicated schoolteacher and going to sleep. She didn't correct him. She labeled the final section, closed the ledger, and looked out the window at the landscape changing as they climbed drier. Higher, the pines coming back, the particular quality of air that meant elevation and distance from the city's accumulated noise. Her chest loosened. She hadn't realized how tight it had been. Felix met her at the Red Hollow stage stop with Esther saddled and a brief nod that constituted, in Felix's vocabulary, a warm welcome. She took the reins and mounted with the ease of someone who had been doing it daily for months and had forgotten that she had ever found it difficult. "Anything happen while I was gone?" she asked. "Roan mare threw a shoe," Felix said. "Cord fixed it. Santa Fe buyer sent a letter. Mr. Mercer told me to tell you it was in the desk. Thank you." Felix, "Welcome back, Miss Whitlock," she rode. The trail up to Cedar Ridge was something she knew now, in the specific physical way, that the body knows things it has repeated enough times, the 3 places where the track narrowed, the switchback that looked sharper than it was, the particular cluster of pines that meant she was 40 minutes from the ranch. The late afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour and this season, and she rode through it without hurrying because the horse was sure-footed and the trail was familiar, and she had 2 days of stage travel in her back and saw no reason to add urgency to the last 40 minutes, when she had managed 2 weeks in Denver without any. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, pine smoke from the cabin stove, horses, dry grass, and the creek, the particular combination that she had filed away in some deep and involuntary part of her memory as home, without ever making a conscious decision to file it there. The awareness that she had done this arrived quietly, without drama, and she let it arrive. She came over the last rise and the ranch spread out below her, and the first thing she saw was Gideon at the North Corral with the roan, working the lead with the patient repetition of a man who understands that some things cannot be rushed and doesn't try. He looked up when he heard Esther's hooves. He went still in the way. He went still when he was paying complete attention to something. She came down into the yard and dismounted at the corral fence. He crossed to the fence. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the morning she'd stood on that courthouse porch with Crane's men behind her, not with relief. Exactly, with something more complete than relief. The specific expression of a man confirming that something he'd been quietly, firmly counting on had turned out to be real. "How was Denver?" he said. Loud, she said. "How's the roan?" "Better. She's been stubborn. She's earned it." He almost smiled. "How'd the testimony go?" "Completely." She tied Esther to the fence and reached into her bag. "The Santa Fe letter. Felix said it came while I was gone. He took it, read it, and handed it back. He wants 2 more horses by spring. I saw that." She put the letter back. "We can do it. I'll write back this week and confirm terms." "We," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." The word sat between them simply, without elaboration, doing the work that all the other conversations had been building toward. Gideon looked at the corral fence. He looked at the roan. He looked at Abby with the expression of a man who has been working up to something for long enough that arriving at it feels both inevitable and slightly terrifying. "I need to give you something," he said. "All right." He went inside. She waited, unsaddling Esther with the automatic ease of months of practice. And when he came back out, he was carrying an envelope. He held it out. She took it. She opened it. Inside was money, a meaningful amount, carefully counted, and a folded letter of introduction to a business owner in Denver that Gideon had apparently written himself. In the plain, direct hand she recognized from the ranch correspondence, recommending Abigail Whitlock as the finest account manager and ranch administrator he had encountered in 20 years of operation. She read the letter. She looked at the money. She looked at him. "You wrote this while I was in Denver," she said. "Yes." Why? He held her gaze steadily. "Because from the moment you arrived here, every man around you decided your future. Your father. Crane in the beginning." He paused. "I'm not going to do it again. If you stay, Abby, I need to know it's because there's nowhere else you'd rather be. Not because Crane made leaving dangerous. Not because the stage schedule was inconvenient. Not because he stopped. Try it again. Not because I made it complicated to go." She looked at the money in her hands. She looked at the letter of introduction. She looked at the ranch behind him, the repaired fence, the south garden where the tomato plants had finished their season and been composted back into the soil they came from, the water barrels still along the south wall, the north corral where the roan stood watching all of this with calm equine judgment. She thought about what he had said and what he had not said. And she thought about what she had said on those old courthouse steps before she'd walked back to the boarding house. And she thought about the new ledgers in her bag with the sections labeled and the fourth quarter waiting to be filled in. She folded the money back into the envelope. She put the envelope in her pocket. Gideon's face shifted slightly, not falling, exactly, but bracing. Abby looked at him. "I'm keeping it," she said. He looked at her pocket. He looked at her face. He was doing the mathematics of that sentence and not yet arriving at the answer. "A woman ought to have enough money to leave whenever she wants," she said. She watched him understand. She watched the understanding move through him. The particular quality of a man who has been holding his breath for an amount of time he hadn't fully admitted. Releasing it. "And I'm staying," she said. "Because I want to." He was very still. "Gideon," she said, "I labeled the fourth quarter ledger sections on the stage from Red Hollow." He stared at her. "I labeled them," she said, "because I was planning to fill them in here. Because I live here. Because this ranch is where I work and where I built something real, and where my tomatoes grew, and where someone repaired my mother's mirror, and where I learned that a cracked thing in a good frame is still worth." Keeping her voice had gone quieter but not softer. "I didn't come back to Denver for you. I came back from Denver for me. And I'm staying for me. That's what I need you to understand." "I understand," he said immediately. "I'm not staying because I'm grateful. I know. Or because I don't have other options. I know that too. I have the letter of introduction," she said. "I could go to Denver and build something there. I've thought about it. I know you have. And Cedar Ridge is where I want to be." She held his gaze. "That's the whole of it. Is that enough?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "It's everything." Neither of them moved for a beat. Then Abby reached into her bag and produced the new ledgers. She held them out. He looked at them. "Fourth quarter," she said. "I have a system I want to show you for the horse operation tracking. It'll make the buyer contracts easier to cross-reference with the delivery schedule." He took the ledgers. He looked at them in his hands with the expression of a man who is being shown something practical and is aware that it is also something else entirely and is choosing to let both things be true at once. "After supper," he said. "After supper," she agreed. She took Esther's reins and led her toward the corral. Behind her she heard Gideon go back inside, and she heard the particular sound of a man moving through a house differently than he had moved through it before, not faster or slower. Just differently, the way a space sounds when someone inhabits it, rather than simply occupying it. She put Esther up. She scratched the roan behind the ear, which the horse endured with the tolerance of an animal that has decided this person is acceptable. She went inside. The stove was already going. Gideon had put the new ledgers on the desk beside the old ones. which she appreciated. She unpacked her bag, setting the remaining items in the places they belonged, and they had places, specific places, because she had assigned them, and they had stayed, and that was what belonging looked like, in the practical language of a woman who understood that home is not a feeling you wait to have, but a thing you build by. Putting things where they go and coming back to them. She set her mother's repaired mirror on the shelf beside the desk. Both halves of the reflection looked back at her. She looked fine. Better than fine, actually. She went to start supper. It was the kind of meal she had learned to make on this simple. Good, requiring nothing she didn't have and wasting nothing she did. Gideon came in from the final evening check of the herd when the food was ready and washed up at the basin and sat down at the table and ate with the appreciation of a man who has not had a decent meal in 2 weeks and is not going to say so directly, but communicates it through the thoroughness of his attention to the food. "The Kansas buyer," he said, between the first and second plate. "Henry told me he might have interest," she said, "before he left with Pike. I made a note. Worth writing to him. I already drafted the letter in my head on the stage." She reached for the bread. "I'll write it tomorrow." He looked at her. "In your head on the stage," he said. "I had 2 days and a bad view. You drafted a business letter in your head. It's not complicated. Introduction, description of the stock, pricing framework. Invitation to inspect in spring." She set the bread down. "Do you want me to write it or not?" "I want you to write it," he said. "I also want you to know that's not that I'm not asking you to stay because of the correspondence. I know why you're asking me to stay," she said. He was quiet. "You haven't asked me," she said, "technically." Another quiet. "Would you build a life with me?" he said. He said it plainly. Without flourish, the way he said things that mattered stripped of ceremony, because the thing itself was enough, and he had never been a man who needed decoration on important things. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had said "I didn't buy you" before he knew her name, who had moved his bedroll to the barn loft without being asked, who had told her the truth when she asked for it, even when the truth was hard, who had built shade for her tomato plants and repaired her mother's mirror and written her a letter of introduction to use if she chose to leave, who had, when the time came, opened the door instead of closing it. Yes, she said. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. They were married in Red Hollow 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony attended by Pike, Felix, Cord, Holt, Henry from Kansas, and the practical landlady from the Denver boarding house, who had made the trip up because Abby had written to tell her, and she had decided that was the kind of news worth making a trip for. Gideon wore his best shirt, which Abby had repaired so thoroughly that it looked better than new. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had purchased in Denver Practical. Well cut, the color of the late autumn sky over Cedar Ridge, which was a blue so particular and so clear that she had stood in the fabric shop and known immediately. The ceremony was brief. Neither of them was interested in length for its own sake. Afterward, Felix raised a toast with the particular solemnity of a man who takes toasts seriously. And Cord said something that made Holt laugh, for the first time Abby had ever witnessed. And Henry shook Gideon's hand and told Abby she was the reason he'd decided to become an honest man, which was the nicest thing anyone said all day. They rode back to Cedar Ridge that evening. The ranch was quiet when they arrived. The autumn had arrived fully now. The air sharp and clean, the cattle settled in the lower pasture for the cold months ahead. The fence lines holding. Abby had winterized the supply arrangements in October. The pantry was stocked. The accounts were current through the end of the year. And the first 2 contracts for the spring horse operation were signed and filed in the desk. She stood on the porch. She looked at the valley below, where the cattle were dark shapes in the last of the light. Moving slowly in the early evening quiet, Gideon came to stand beside her. They stood there together without talking, the way they had learned to stand together comfortably, without the need to fill the space with anything other than what was already there. After a while, he said, "Felix thinks the roan is ready to start the buyer training next week," she said. After I finished the Kansas letter. After the Kansas letter, he agreed. She looked at the valley. She thought about the woman who had stood in this yard 5 months ago with a broken suitcase and a cracked mirror, and a lie her father had dressed up as an arrangement. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself, that she was dependent, powerless, without options, defined entirely by the men who had shaped the edges of her life. She thought about what that woman had become, not through rescue, not through someone deciding her future for her in a kinder direction. Through work, through truth, through the slow, deliberate business of choosing, day by day, what she would do with the life that had been handed to her so carelessly by someone who had never understood its value. People would tell this story later, in Red Hollow and in Denver and in places she would never go. And they would tell it wrong. They would tell it as the story of the woman who was sent to a mountain man and fell in love with him. Which was true in the way that a cracked mirror is true the right shape, but missing something. The real story was not what happened to Abigail Whitlock. The real story was what Abigail Whitlock decided to do with what happened to her. Her father had tried to make her a payment. Crane had tried to make her leverage. The frontier itself had tried to convince her that a woman alone needed someone else to write the terms of her own existence. And she had sat down at a desk with a pen and a crate full of chaos and built something real: accounts, systems, contracts, choices, until the life around her reflected the woman she had always been, when nobody was deciding what she was allowed to know or feel or want. Cedar Ridge became her home only after she'd had the freedom to leave it. Gideon became the man she loved precisely because when the time came, when the envelope was in her hands and the road was clear and the choice was entirely hers, he had opened the door and stepped back and trusted her to walk through it in whatever direction she chose. She had chosen him, not as rescue, not as refuge, not as the lesser of two difficult options. As a partner, a man she had watched choose better. Day by day, better became who he simply was. She turned from the valley. She went inside. She opened the new ledger to the first page of the fourth quarter, picked up her pen and began. Cedar Ridge Ranch was not what Silas Whitlock had traded away. It was what Abigail Mercer had built, and she had built it on her own terms, in her own hand, from the wreckage of someone else's bad accounting, which was, she thought, exactly the kind of work she had always been best at.